Hi, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the Mayer Museum of Art. We're so happy to see you here tonight for the 24th Annual Helen Clark Berlin Symposium. I'm Martha Johnson, and I'm the director here. And so thank you so much for coming out for this wonderful panel that we have going on. The Berlin Symposium is always held in conjunction with the college's annual exhibition of contemporary art. And we are surrounded tonight by the 104th annual exhibition. Most of that gratitude, and she's made this possible for us. I also want to thank President Bradley Bateman over here. Please raise your hand. Thank you. For his keen interest in our theme and for his enthusiasm and support for this exhibition, and also for Question Bridge in the neighboring gallery. The annual exhibition of contemporary art is one of several important traditions and contributions that make up the Louise Jordan Smith legacy. We got more seats in the front, everybody. Come on up. Smith was one of the first 5 resident professors when the college opened as Randolph-Macon Women's College in 1891. And in 1900, she declared, "I want an annual exhibition. This exhibition must contain only the best artwork that is done anywhere. It should be understood that each year the best pictures should be purchased for a permanent collection. If the history of our nation may be foreseen by the light which other nations give us, we may know that our influence will last longest through our art." The first annual exhibition was installed in 1911, and on the occasion of the 80th annual exhibition, friends and family of Helen Clark Berlin, class of 1958, established a symposium in her honor, which would expand and extend the educational impact of the exhibition. The centerpiece of the symposium is this interactive panel discussion. We're fortunate to have on the panel today 3 of the artists included in the exhibition: Kevin Beasley, Todd Gray, and Toyin Odutola. And perhaps Question Bridge might be silenced at this time. Thank you. Kevin Beasley. Wave your hand around, Kevin. Raise your hand. Kevin Beasley was born in Lynchburg, Virginia. In 1985, and attended public schools, graduating from Heritage High School. He earned his BFA in 2007 at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, Michigan, and went on to earn his MFA at Yale in 2012. That same year, he gained a lot of attention for a sound piece he created in the atrium of the Museum of Modern Art, which literally shook those hallowed halls. Building on his experiments in materiality and sound, Beasley developed a site-specific sound sculpture and performance for the 2014 Whitney Biennial. Kevin's sculptures evolve out of an inventive performative process that incorporates found materials, including the artist's own clothing, into composite objects. His piece is over here. Beasley gives sculpture to these materials using a mixture of polyurethane foam and resin. During the half hour the compound takes to set and harden, he is able to push and mold the objects into their sculptural form. His sculptures trace the movement and actions of his body while also themselves representing bodies or flesh, though fragmented or dismembered. Reworking traditions of process, art, and assemblage, Beasley's sculptures are rooted in the personal and particular contexts of their materials and in the urban, post-industrial landscapes in which he has lived, including Detroit, New Haven, Connecticut, and New York City, and Lynchburg. Todd Gray. There he is. He knows the way. He received both his BFA and MFA from the California Institute of the Arts Recent solo and group exhibitions include the Luckman Gallery, California State University in Los Angeles, the Studio Museum in Harlem, USC Fisher Museum of Art in Los Angeles, the California African American Museum, and the Tucson Museum of Art and the Detroit Museum of Art. He just closed a solo exhibition at Samson Projects in Boston, Massachusetts. During the 1970s, while still in high school, Todd worked as a commercial photographer in the music industry. He photographed the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, and Gladys Knight, among many others. After graduating with his BFA from Cal Arts, he was asked by Michael Jackson to become his personal photographer, which he did from 1979 through 1983 during Jackson's albums Off the Wall and Thriller. You might have heard of those. His most recent photo works are comprised of photographs gathered from his own archive and recontextualized, adding the use of antique frames as a structuring device, and these are his works over here. Toyin Odutola was born in Nigeria in 1985, here it is too, and came to this country with her parents as a child. She focuses on identity and the socio-political concept of skin color through her pen and ink drawings. Her work explores her personal journey of moving and assimilating into American culture in conservative Alabama. Toyin attended the Norfolk Summer Residency for Music and Art at Yale University in 2007. In 2008, she earned her BA in Studio Art at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and went on to earn her MFA at the California College of the Arts in 2012. She's had solo exhibitions every year since then, including My Country Has No Name at the Jack Shaman Gallery in New York in 2013, Toyin Odutola, The Constant Wrestler at the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art in 2013 and 14, Like the Sea, also at Jack Shaman in 2014, and Toyin Odutola, Untold Stories at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, Missouri, earlier this year in the spring. Our moderator tonight is Evie Terrono, and I'd like to introduce her now and then pass the program over to her. Professor Terrono joined the faculty of Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia in 1990, where she teaches art history. In her research, Terrono seeks to understand the complexities of the commissions of Civil War monuments and the multifaceted political underpinnings that define their reception then and now. Terrono is interested in the memory and commemoration of the Civil War, its actors and its heroes, and the sites of memory in which contested remembrances of the conflict continue to be reenacted. She has a forthcoming article entitled Great Generals and Christian Soldiers, Commemorations of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in the Civil Rights Era, in which she analyzes memorials at Wyman Park in Baltimore and at the National Cathedral, both of which are being reconsidered and challenged today. So please join me in welcoming our panelists and our moderator.
It is quite a rare privilege to be in such a space where we are encountering the products of such fertile imaginations that cover the range of aesthetic and ideological perspectives and literally invite us to probe beyond the surface and understand the meaning beyond the aesthetics. And for me in particular, as Martha said, as an academic who researches race and national identity and our complicated relationship as a nation with the realities of race, both in its historical framework, but also, and more particularly, in our own reality, the artist perspectives here provide a very, very rich inventory to mine for meanings that hopefully will alert us to the ongoing challenges that we face as a nation dealing with blackness in our society, and certainly these artists have provided us with their remarkably rich and very intellectual and vigorous environment in which to engage with such manners. I will keep my comments to the absolute minimum because, of course, they are the protagonists of this story that they tell so vibrantly through their work. And I must say that in the last couple of days, we've had the opportunity to have very many conversations and share our interests. And I'm hoping that in this dialogue, we're going to explore not only their aesthetic, but also their ideological motivations. So I would like to begin with you, Toyin, because your work, well, I decided to go with the youth first, and then come to experience. To a great extent, it's extraordinary that both of you, of course, were born in the 1920s, which seems virtually inconceivable, but you have such urgency in your work. And of course, in your case, you are referring to a venerable academic tradition of drawing, but you have reinvented the norm. So I was wondering if you could address the ways in which your work
just going to take the mic. I don't know how to do this. That'd be very awkward. 85's here. I did start with a very traditional sort of education. I mean, my art education actually was more independent study, I think. And so, you know, I took figure drawing and, you know, formative courses. And in that, the teacher always tells you, all right, we're going to measure the face. Let's break it up into components, measurable components, so you can measure the distance and you can draw it without really trying to map it out. And you can do it from your head. And I took it to the most perverse, and you could take it. I wanted it to feel more organic, and I wanted to really break up the components that make up a face. And I often said early on when I was formulating this style, my drawings, the feet over there with the white socks, and some of them in the entrance there. And I was really interested in the rhythmic aspect of how I would kind of break up the face, and the striated marks are really fascinating to me. But I always thought landscape. You know, I look at the figures that I create as a place. That's why many of these pieces are devoid of context, with the exception of the feet there. But because time and place, well, not really time or place, was very important to me, obviously. When Martha was introducing us, you know, I came here to America at a very young age, and I was lost and, you know, confused little kid. And so to me, drawing and creating a drawing, I remember the first time creating a drawing felt like this is my land here in this piece of paper. And that was very powerful. And so I wanted to, that's why I'm always attracted to representational work, portraiture, figures, because through that I can remap my life. And I don't feel like, you know, I'm just traversing through this kind of, you know, non-linear space where everything is kind of, you know, I feel very precarious, or I don't feel like I can put down roots, you know. When you make a mark, when I make these marks on, you know, with the skin and how layered the marks are, for me, that's like, I don't want you to erase it, you know, I mean, it's there, you know, and that's very, you know, opposite to the experience that I had growing up. We traveled a lot, we moved a lot. So I guess if I don't know if I'm even answering the question, but it's sort of my roundabout way of saying that the style really is coming from a place of wanting to, one, establish a place, a landscape, for us to, as a viewer, to see a person in this way. And two is, going into the blackness very early on, it was, how does black skin feel like? I don't really care so much what it looks like. You know, there's so many artists who do it so much better than me. Carrie James Marshall comes to mind. That kind of flatness, because that is, of course, the social construct of blackness. And I'm very well educated in that, all of us here are. What I was more interested in was the feeling of it, to live in that skin, in that place, and how that affects you psychologically, and how that affects other people, and how they look at you. And you know, I would often say in my critiques in graduate school, which we've discussed before, you know, I'm not interested in people just looking. I want you to see it. There's a difference because it's acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, there's an empathy. And I think a lot of people really don't understand. And so I hope through my work, and the figures I create, they can understand. So.
Well, you provided us, of course, pathways to investigate further in terms of identity. And it's interesting, of course, your heritage, right? The artistic lineage that you're tracing in your work in terms of the work of Marshall, but also how do you interrogate his approach in terms of the complete absence of narrative in your work and the tensions that that creates. You don't provide a framework within which the viewer can read the works in a particular storytelling tradition, which of course creates a remarkably heightened experience because you engage the viewer immediately with the personality that you're trying to create.
No, I'm sorry, I'm really nervous. I don't know why. A lot of the, like for instance, there's a piece right there in the hallway of a really, it's actually, I'm very proud that it's in this show because it's a really close friend of mine named Texas. He's a trans black man, and I'm so happy that it got selected because I feel very passionate about the rights of transgender people right now. I feel like, you know, they've always been there, and you know, he's looking directly at you when you come at it. And a lot of my portraits early on, because there was no narrative, the conversation was the look that they were looking at you. Yes, it's a two-dimensional plane. It's an inanimate object. It's not a person. It's a piece of paper with marks on it. I'm sorry?
That's good.
Oh, thank you. And I think that sort of direct engagement is a powerful thing. It's a political statement. And I believe when you sent us the emails, you were talking about, you know, politics and how do you mitigate that in your work. And I feel like even in grad school, I would have people say, I don't know what message I'm going to say. Like, if you make a mark, it's there. You know, it's not going anywhere. That's a political statement. And I feel like anyone who chooses to publish anything or to show something, it's a political statement. But for me, what the lack of narrative is just to get all of the superfluous stuff out of the way, you know, and really get at the heart of something. So the direct gaze is really important to me, which is funny because a lot of the other pieces aren't. But yeah, that's kind of where I supplement with the lack of context.
So of course I can scratch off one of my next questions because one of the questions coming up actually for all of you was the dynamics and the dialectics of the gaze that is so of course fraught in art historical experience. So since you brought this up, can you all address how do you engage with what is a historically very challenging reality of having the racialized body engage us through the gaze?
Since you abstracted so much, do you want to go first?
Okay. I have one story from when I was in graduate school, actually. I had the pleasure of having a studio visit with Mark Bradford, and his work is there on the wall, actually. And at the time, I was working with I was sort of developing a project, or I had just finished the thesis, and so the relief of building up to the thesis was gone, but I had these residual actions and projects and things that were still existing in the studio. And there was one thing that I was working on which had to deal with a cotton gin motor that I picked up from Alabama, like Maplesville, Alabama, in December not December actually, like February of 2012, which was right before I graduated. And this had come from a project where I actually went down to some family property in New Brunswick County and around Lawrenceville, where I had experienced, and I'm gonna get there, but it's kind of I actually experienced seeing cotton for the first time grown in a field. And for me, there was a really distinct recognition that I hadn't dealt with this on a really personal level. This was like family property, and what I knew was history, the kind of social construct that we sort of exist in, and the experiences of that history of slavery and what it has amounted to now. But going to a comfortable place like family, and it was actually for a family reunion. Experiencing that was really sort of gripping and kind of shocking to me. So fast forward, I ended up going down to Virginia in the winter of 2011 to kind of further investigate. So I stayed on the property for 3 days and 2 nights, just working, taking video, and doing a lot of sound recording. I was making objects. I was doing really oddball things. And it amounted to me actually picking some of the cotton, bringing it back to New Haven. And when I had the cotton, I was thinking, well, how do I process this in 2 ways? Like, how do I actually process the cotton to make something? And how do I process what I just experienced mentally? And it amounted to me finding this cotton gin motor that ran a cotton farm from 1940 to 1973. And I got in contact with the guy, and he went down, drove down in 2 days, spent an entire day, and he told me just his history of his entire life. And I was really kind of blown away by his generosity and the experience of that. And I brought this motor back to New Haven. And so I had this thing sitting in my studio, and it weighs actually a ton. It was 2,500 pounds. It had to be freighted. It's 3 by 4 feet. And Mark Bradford walks into the studio, and we start talking. And I'm talking about this work and talking about like my personal experience. And he just stopped and he said, one thing you have to realize is that you as a black artist will always be under that gaze. You will constantly have to face that, regardless of if you want to or not. So when you're talking to me about this, when these are the things that sort of become the initial conversation, then realize that the other things that make up who you are, that may not be definitively described as a black experience or something that a black person would be interested in, you may never get to those. And so the idea that how you image yourself, how you project yourself, how you move through is a more holistic. There's more of a person than just what the gaze can see. And so I realized that, and I knew that before, but I think part of the problem is that when you're dealing with that, it's really hard to navigate. It's how do you actually find the correct language to communicate this, and how do you let the work really exist in a way that it's supposed to. So finding the appropriate forms and materials that really addresses you as a person, because your experiences, all of these things are embedded in. So I think in terms of dealing with the gaze, there is a way that, for me, that I find is most appropriate if I just begin with who I am, because this is a result of my experience. And if I'm honest with myself and how these objects come into fruition, then it'll be there, it'll be present.
First off, I want to thank the museum and the college, Martha and staff for having us here, and even more so for you coming out, because without viewers, without audience, art is inert, it's dead. It needs to have a dialogue, it needs someone present, so thank you so much. As far as the gaze goes, working with photographs are tricky because when we look at a photograph, we process this object as if we are looking at the thing itself. So when you're looking at a picture of your mother, you react as if your mother's in the room. You know, it's such a strong and clear signifier. So I'm always trying to deal with that aspect and seeing how I can subvert that and flip it and change it, which is why I problematize my photographs, which is why you don't see the face, so that you have to apply much more effort to navigate the photograph, to come up with your own relationship and form your own dialogue. Now, when you see when you see a black body, when you see black skin, that already comes with a set of values depending on your individual history and experience. So what I want to do is circumvent that preconceived notion that you already have, that response that you already have, because I throw all sorts of roadblocks in front of it. There's a landscape, but there's something else. So you have to be conscious of constructing meaning. You just cannot apply pre-digested meaning from your initial gaze. And that really goes contrary to how we're built as human beings. Because we're built as fight or flight. We got here, we're all here today, because our brain wants to identify, am I going to eat it, or is it going to eat me? So we, in a flash, in a very quick moment, we have to decide if this is friend or foe, and which is why we take shortcuts and we make quick decisions about things. And stereotypes come about and so forth and so on. So knowing that our brains process like that, I try to put a little wrench in that mechanism. So you have to, well, I'm not quite sure, and then now you have to process. Now you have to make meaning. So that's how I deal with the gaze. I try to subvert the process of a pre-digested, pre-formulated response or projection onto the images you see. And I try to introduce history, so time is displaced, and the idea of place, geographical place. But that's enough right now.
So you're suggesting this context that is fluid, that is constantly evolving, and particularly in terms of the recontextualization of Michael Jackson's identity. I'm fascinated by the fact that you're reusing the image, but you're recreating, reframing the narrative in very radical ways. And in your reference to incorporating history, to incorporating philosophical perspectives, I would very much be interested in hearing how in your newer work, in your more recent work, Michael Jackson is not the king, is not the iconic personality that we all think of, but rather carries broader ideological associations that at times can be very disruptive to our perceptions of who he was.
So, for several years I served as his personal photographer, and I thought I would dive back into my archive of Michael Jackson photographs. So Atlanta by Vote is a photograph of, that's Michael sitting down in the presidential suite at the Peachtree Hotel in Atlanta. And I thought, who is the most recognized black person in the world? It's not Obama. It's Michael Jackson. I have a studio in Ghana, and when I even go to a little village, I can show someone a picture, mention that name, boom, that's Michael. You know, he is the most recognized man of color. And so I thought, well, here's a perfect opportunity to use him as a signifier. You know, okay, then what is blackness on a global scale? Look at it as a signifier as commodity, because we know him because of records, which are sales, which generate capital, which push products, and so forth and so on. He's a commodified body. And then he represents a whole lot of other things depending time and place, good or bad, right? So I thought, you know, that would be a perfect figure to use in my work. And also it's my history. Then along that, I do not want your preconceived ideas of Michael Jackson to usurp your own thinking and your own critical response to the photograph. So I want to obscure his identity, which is why when I have a picture of Michael Jackson in my work, you hardly ever see the face, because that would be too easy, and then you would always just come to your own quick conclusion. And I want to interact, I want to engage and have a dialogue, and a more enhanced dialogue. So hence in that one, that's a photograph of a young man who is in a village in Ghana called Nzulezu. And he is wearing just the wonderful white garb that is so popular with the British colonialists. And he is traveling, proper, he's dressed proper. And he is traveling on a dugout canoe because he lives on a lake. The whole village is on a lake. And so I thought, Atlanta, bodies of water, this circular connection, how I'm here because of the Atlantic Ocean. I wouldn't be here without the Atlantic Ocean. So in this way, it's history, and it's also a very surrealist gesture. Who was it? This is not a pipe. Magritte, that's a Magritte gesture, simple as can be, just obscuring the face, putting a big apple in front of it, and so forth. So I was thinking of other gestures in art history that can also be unpacked or related to. And then I had read something, and I'll end up with this. I read something by the critical thinker, Caribbean intellect called Stuart Hall. And in one of his writings, he had said that power is so all-consuming, and it's everywhere. Power and systems of power and dominance are so inescapable. It's like water is to a fish. It's all-consuming, and you don't even know it's there. All the influences that have guided us in life, we're not even aware of it because it's so all-consuming. So I thought, how can I use, and then he went on to say that dominant culture wants to control minority culture, or that which is not. Majority culture will always want to control minority culture, and that's just the way it is. And so look at history and so forth. And I thought, okay, I agree with that, and I certainly identify myself as minority culture, not the dominant culture. He went on to say that the only way that we can execute agency and power is to resist the control of our image, our naming, by dominant culture, because they can name us anything for their own, for dominant culture's own need. And where our power resides is in the act of resistance, constant resistance. So keep changing, keep moving, being nomadic. And by that way, a new name, a new strategy for controlling how you're represented, naming you, telling you who you are, instead of you naming yourself, your own culture coming out and defining itself. You can make that more complex, and you can then exercise your own agency by this change. And so by that way, I problematize what you're seeing by introducing other photographs and little other barriers.
The bodily presence, of course, is such a defining characteristic in all your work, and particularly in your case, Kevin. In a review about a year ago, Helen in the New York Times suggested that there are compressed traces of the body in your work, and earlier on you spoke, of course, of the kind of autobiography that projects itself in your pieces in terms of the choices and the processes. But looking at your work in this space, of course, it brings up further associations with the mutilated body, the partial body, the tortured body, the marginalized body. that goes beyond the personal experience to identify, of course, broader historical contexts. And I wonder if you would like to talk about both the process that you're following and a kind of distillation that takes place in order to arrive from the material to this pregnant object full of potential.
Yeah, I think to kind of start with the studio practice, although I feel like most of the gestures and things that I do in the studio are an accumulation of things that are actually outside of the studio, like seeing something, or I had an experience where I was in Queens walking to the subway, and there were a pair of Air Force Ones, these sneakers, Nike shoes, that were sitting on a grate, and they were positioned in a way that was really, really odd to me. Like it felt like there was a body attached to them, or that there was some kind of ownership or relationship to them. But they were kind of grimy, you know, they weren't like the best kept shoes. And then maybe like, I don't know, a couple hours later I came back and they were gone. And I was like, oh, okay, these weren't just abandoned shoes, these were actually placed for some reason. So there was that initial feeling that I had about these things was related to some type of body, these extremities, even just in their arrangement or in their placement. And that kind of sparked a work in the studio that I was doing that was actually, I had shown for the biennial. And when I was thinking about that, I always am working from my own sort of personal clothing or personal items or things that I find that I can identify some sort of relationship to. It's just where I began. I ended up, I think a lot about the relationship of Jordan brand shoes to this kind of violence, to blackness, to youth culture, and in some way trying to navigate what that may feel like what is the kind of sentiment that surrounds that. You know, it's a troubled one when people are, since the 80s, when those shoes were, when Jordan Brand was just starting, and he was basically had just gotten a sponsorship with Nike, and the first pair of Jordans that came out, there were kids that were getting beaten and killed and thrown in the woods just for their shoes, and it hasn't stopped since then. And so I've been fascinated with what that is because of my proximity, growing up and wanting really nice pairs of shoes and not getting them because they're so expensive. But then also the other aspect of that is that you can become a target quite easily. So then thinking about how in the studio I deal with these objects and I deal with these things in a really sort of physical way. My process is very much so performative, which I realized in retrospect, something that sort of arrived from literally spilling a bunch of stuff in the studio. You're making something and you're working with material that really develops quickly. It has a certain bond, like the resins that I use. They're very luscious. I can do a lot of things with them. There's a lot within the casting process that's allows me to get forms that maybe I can't think of in my head, but I can definitely mold and shape them when these things are forming. And in some way, there is a violence to that. There is a kind of assertiveness. There's also discovery. There's the process of generating something more spontaneously, more intuitively. It allows me to say, like, okay, these are the physical limitations of my body. These are the physical limitations of this space that I'm in. And this is what I have. So I kind of work with that. And so combining that with these objects, these shoes, or whatever the clothes that I'm using, they end up being, for me, an accumulation of several layers of experience, several layers of trying to actually figure something out in the moment. And in the moment of crystallization, that's what's being being evidenced as you're seeing these marks or you're seeing these things that are coming from gestures and time. And I think that a lot of like casting material does that. It allows you to leave some sort of mark or imprint, and it remains. I think that maybe that's like a roundabout way of getting to that.
In the process of bringing some very, very interesting perspectives, sorry, I forgot about the microphone. In my real life, I don't go around speaking into a microphone. Both you and Todd bring up this idea of the branding of otherness, the commodification of the Black body that is exploited and re-exploited, particularly in our contemporary culture, where, of course, a public persona is seen very much as a position of privilege, but a number of artists, of course, have explored the possibilities of companies literally marketing Black identities for their own interests. To what extent is the price of fame an exploitation of Blackness? Hank, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Exactly.
This piece back here is a collaboration between Hank Willis Thomas and Sanford Biggers, and Hank's work deals directly with exactly what you're talking about. I mean, he's actually used the air mic sign with I think it was like a mutual fund tree, and he's hanging from the tree on a noose. You know, he's done a lot of work with the Nike scarification, which is, you know, refers to the scars that a lot of slaves received from whippings with the Nike symbol. So you'll see a body or a torso with just Nike signs across the chest. And it's very powerful work, and it's very direct. It's actually quite old, really, but it feels very contemporary. I mean, it still applies. And I feel like, particularly, I'm going to be a little dissenting here. There is a focus on the male Black body in this a lot. And I find, sorry.
No, I was thinking also of the Ida Wiley,
True.
the Nissan ad.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I find it, oh God, this is okay. I'm very interested also just in children and women and how that is problematic. And I'm not just talking about tropes here either. I mean, just like a Black woman's body is the most commodified body. And, you know, and this idea of like, you know, I keep coming back to this thing that you said, Todd, earlier about trying to disrupt the gaze and trying to really make it difficult to see something as you're used to seeing it. And one thing reason why I started drawing men was because when I first started working, it was mostly the female figure that I worked with. One, because it was just me in my studio alone. I didn't really afford big models. But the thing that really fascinated me was that when you present a Black woman's body, even as an artwork, it's amazing the projections that people have. And even furthermore, if you present a naked, not nude, because it's not spectacle that I'm going for, but a naked Black woman's body, it's an entirely different situation. You have this like range. The most extreme tend to be the one that plays out the most. It's just, I can't look at you directly, because often, like I said, the gaze would be directly at you. So imagine a Black woman standing full, you know, life size, looking directly at the viewer, and that would cause a lot of people to say, I can't look at this one. Whereas the other one would be like, ooh, what's this about? And it'd be this sort of, I don't know, maybe Jezebel or sort of this lasciviousness about it. And I had to stop, because no matter what narrative I had or what my intentions were, which were very clinical actually, I wasn't trying to push any sort of agenda. It was, this is a Black body, and it's a body that you don't see looking at you, you know, like a lot of the sort of almanac portraits that you see of slaves, like Carrie Mae Weems' work, you know. that was kind of what I was addressing. So I started doing black male figure with my work, and it was interesting what would happen, because then there was this need to inject subjectivity to them, which I never saw. And I don't know what that was, what that caused, that suddenly people wanted to give them narratives, whereas they didn't want to give my female figures narratives at all. And it was like, a little side-eye moment, it's kind of, okay. I'm not, like attacking anybody. It's something to think about, this idea of like the branded body. I mean, I'm literally branding with my marks, and it's the same process, but it's somehow different when you present a naked black male's body. It makes them very uncomfortable because there is a history of that image. But when it's a child, because I have children as well, it's the same reaction as women, suddenly no one really wants to address it directly. And the subjectivity is questioned. And, for me, that's something I remember I think I told you maybe yesterday, I said, I didn't know I was the only woman in this exhibition, which is really fascinating to me, because this gendered look at the black male body. Because when I draw these figures, or any black male figure, by de facto that my tools are black, because whether or not the subject is black or not, I don't say. But I'm very considerate of these things. I'm always considerate of their subjectivity. I'm always considerate of their identity, for lack of a better word. But it's weird how the read is very different. So even if I am going through great pains to give that, that strength, that selfhood, it doesn't read that way. And I don't know how that, I don't know, maybe I'll pass the mic, maybe why that is so. I don't know why that read comes, I don't know why I went that way. But that's just something that came up when I was thinking about it, because now I'm more interested in making it difficult for people to see. Like the works I'm doing now are kind of completely outside of that. Like I'm interested in, I talked about, I'm doing a series now for a show in South Africa called To the Young, Gifted, and Black. Movement. And I remember when Hank, presented to me, I said, I'm not going to do the victims because it's too hard. It's too hard. But I tell you what I will do. I'm going to take this title, I'm going to use it very literally. So I decided to do a series of drawings of prominent white men who are gifted and were young in the reference photos that I found of them. I'm talking like Ringo from the Beatles, Bob Dylan, you get it, you get it. So, and I'm drawing them with black ballpoint pen, just their skin. I'm not touching their hair, I'm not touching their clothes from the reference photos I'm drawing from. And I'm gonna line them up in a grid. And it's this idea that the sameness of the treatment of their skin completely makes you not see their selfhood anymore. They're not individuals, they're part of a group. And that is exactly what these victims, since history, have had. They're not individuals, they don't have selfhood. They're in the sameness of the group, they're in the same wash, which is the blackness. And thus, when you apply that, like I love when when I show the work to people, they're like, oh, I think that's David Bowie. I'm like, it doesn't matter who he is. It doesn't matter what he's done. It's just that guy, of many guys. And that's something that I find very interesting. And when you can disrupt what people they want to inject it so much. And it's well-meaning. I'm not like trying to be a jerk. I hope other people don't think I'm being a jerk. But it makes you think about that much more.
You suggested that narratives are imposed from outside, and you talked about that, of course, the fact that selves are formed, not necessarily generated from within, but imposed from without through structures of power that predetermine our personas, and particularly, of course, in the case of Black individuals, residuals of colonialism and our own experience still define how we view the Black body. And you suggested the gendered perspectives in the reception of the work, But I wonder, for all of you, in the absence of didactics in an exhibition such as this, is the meaning of your work a kind of synergistic exercise between the viewer and your work? Do you anticipate a particular response? Is there a particular framework of reference, of ideological reference, that you would like the audience to engage in by looking at your work?
I only want the clarity of that framework to be present in my relationship with the piece. It's something that it has to be, that's one of it's got to hit that spot for me, and it must resonate, this ideological position or political position. It needs to be clear for me when I look at the piece going, yes, that means that for me. But I realized there's as many interpretations of the work as there are people in this room. And I cannot control that because but what I can do is I can problematize and make more complex your reading of the work. So, and while you are creating a narrative to it, you just cannot, as I said earlier, break it down to a simple stereotypical or preconceived notion of what it is you're looking at. So you have to be active, you got to think, synapses fire. But one thing I will say is I'm always struggling against normative thinking patterns, normative behavior, because we're always in flux. And there's an illusion, to just digress a little bit, there's an illusion that a photograph is fixed, that it fixes time, that it stops time. So I try to actually unfix time, make the photograph more active, even though it's not time-based like video or movie, because you have to put this picture, these photos together in your head. You got to juggle that in your head. So you're making this movement in your head, the act of looking. But no, I make no demands. But I'm hoping that I'm putting enough ingredients on the table when you bake your cake that you have some idea what it's going to taste like. But I'm not going to determine what that taste is.
Yeah, and that's pretty much I have a really similar approach in thinking about that, because this is why I think context is really important that the work enters into, because that also shapes how one perceives it, how you experience it. So a lot of times it's really what I arrive at in the studio, right, should snap together in a way that I'm working or what I'm thinking about. And the decision to then share it, the decision to say, okay, well, this work should enter into a particular space or should be experienced in a particular way. I think those decisions are geared towards, in some way, understanding that context and trying to actually, for the performance that I did at MoMA, Ralph Lemon was the curator for that. And when we walked to the atrium to see the site, the first thing he said to me is, "This is your audience." And I looked around and there were barely any black people, and it was all tourists. And so then thinking about the work that I had created or the work that I had made would have a totally different read just in that kind of space. So then the decision to say, okay, so then should we do this? And then if we are going to do it, then how should we realize it in this space? And I think that's in part about facilitating how the work exists once it does leave once it leaves the studio, or you've sort of you've created it, you've made this object or this thing. Its life doesn't end there, and it will continue depending on what that context is. So the conversation I constantly have with people is, I'm not dead, like I'm still around. So I would like to be able to readdress these things, because it's also, in part, it's how I process and understand the world that I'm living in. So in a way, these objects become ways for me to sort of understand maybe the context that they exist in and the situation that they're entering into. and that audience, how they're received, what that response is, what gets conjured up. But yeah, no high expectations, I think.
In 1989, in what is now much read essay, Trey Ellis suggested the new Black aesthetic, which he proposed would be unencumbered by the legacies of slavery. And he proposed that African American artists could move very freely in middle class spaces, take advantage of the opportunities that these spaces provide, and establish a new identity, perhaps independent of identities of Blackness. Is this a post-Blackness experience? I suppose, just from your reaction,
The answer is no.
No, I feel like there's a relationship to the conversation we were having about like being allowed to like given permission to produce mediocrity or something.
Yes.
There's like you can then maybe that in some way is related, that you can sort of post-Black is then saying like, well, okay, like yeah, I'm free, but I just want to be mediocre. You know, I don't have to go above and beyond every single thing to be recognized or to be given credit for what that is. There isn't a one-to-one, I think. I don't know.
Okay, I was gonna.
Oh my gosh, it's like the Chris Rock joke. It's all like, you know, I just want to be a C+ president, you know? Like, it's so real. Like, it's so, I mean, it's, you know, Obama is A++, you know? He's the best. He's the best of everything. And that's the problem, too. Because how can you be the best of everything? You're a human being. He's actually more of a writer than a president, I'm just saying. He's a brilliant mind. You know, he's very intellectual, which is strange in that sort of system that he's in. But I love this idea that people have of, I don't know, like you can't, I mean, I'm an African immigrant, so you want to talk to me about being mediocre, that just was not happening in my household. My mother was like, excuse me, you want to do art? That is what you want to do to me? I'm sorry, I did not give birth to you for you to give art.
I've got to agree, my mother was very disappointed when I said I want to go to art school.
The funny thing was, I would go to these, like, you know, Nigerian weddings and things, and they were like, so she's studying graphic arts, like computer graphic arts? And she's like, we're supporting her dream. She's not doing drugs and she's not in jail. But, you know, it's this thing that, you know, you have to be twice as good to be half as, you know, considered. And that is still, I mean, you know, we grew up with that, you know, and now, you know, it's still a thing. I mean, I look at my younger brother and, you know, he's studying engineering right now, software engineering, and it's like he can never fail, ever. Like, it's not even just my family's, you know, imposing. That's it. Like, he knows he can't, because if there's even a slight sense of weakness or inadequacy, it doesn't just affect how he's read as a person. It affects him personally. And it suddenly is reflective of who he is and what his worth is. And it's really interesting because, you know, I guess, you know, we've all gone to art school, and the thing that's so fascinating is that it's full of mediocrity. Absolutely. No, I'm not even saying that as shade. I mean, it really is. And it's almost like celebrated in some cases. Like, some art has to be mediocre because it gets at something else, you know. Perfection is a problem. But even in that, we can't, you know, we have to still be the best of that, which is strange, you know, because art is a very subjective thing. And yet there's still a standard in I don't know, maybe it's self-imposed or not, but I felt it, you know. I mean, that's why my work is painful, you know, in its marks, because I said, well, you know, I'm doing graphic illustrative work, by golly, I'm gonna do it hard, ham. You know, I'm gonna go in, you know, you guys are gonna have to, you don't see it, you know. It's like, you know, critiques are fun with me. And it was funny because I would get these, you know, they're so black, and then they go back to the black, they're so dark, you know, it's a lot. And I'm like, yeah, it's a lot. You know, you give them that crazy eye, you know, and it was because I knew I was a minority. You know, I knew that I was one of, you know, of a graduate class of 54 students. I was one of 2 black students. Another one being a black woman, 2 black women, that was it. You know, and we had to represent so much. And we both would be in the studio at 6 in the morning, hustling. Well, other people were, I don't know, hugging trees. I don't know what they were doing. But they were, you know, they were having that experience. And so the thing that I'm interested in the making of my work is like, how do I introduce ordinariness, banality? There's nothing exceptional about their poses. They're very just there. They're not doing anything, and they have a right not to, because that's enough. Their presence is enough. They don't have to be good for something. They're just good, you know. And that was a process. I had to get there, because, you know, there was always something I had to, oh, maybe there needs to be something else. No, it's enough, just there. You know, there's a piece I did of my brother and a marker on Blackboard, and it's him kind of just sitting on the floor, and he's just kind of looking, you know, my brother's quite the handsome man, so he had to cock his head in the, you know, reference photo, like, you better get that chin, you know, make sure my stomach is in, you know, I'm like, okay, whatever. We all know you're good looking, okay, you know, no, it's fine. But I titled it, You Are Enough As Is, you know, and it's so important because I think I said this in an interview, like there's so, speaking of black male identity, there is this sentence in front of black men. They wake up and that sentence is there, like a clap. And they wear it as armor. You know, they've adopted it. But, you know, sometimes it's hard to really expose a black body like that the way I did. You know, he's naked in the portrait. And the sentence is gone. It's just him. And it's hard sometimes because that sentence is your economy, that's your capital. And if you don't have that, you know, I mean, what is Kanye West without Kanye West? Seriously. Like, you know, we can never see him as just a guy who survived a crash. Even that, just to get rid of that narrative, you know, and just a guy, you know, who's just really creative and you just can't contain it. But he has a sentence, and it's Kanye West, you know, and that's, he can never be mediocre. Even when he's being crazy, he has to be extra great in that craziness, you know.
It's interesting that you bring this up because in the Bearden project, Todd, you related your experiences when he died in your institution and no one recognized his passing, and you wondered as to the degree of greatness that an African American artist has to achieve in order to enter the canonical tradition. And I wonder, considering the considerable achievements of African American artists in our own time, is this mere tokenism? Have the criteria changed?
That's a big question. I cannot, what can I say? Those that are lionized are huge successes in the marketplace. There are artists in this room that command 7 figures. I won't point out which one, because then you're going to really have to triple your security. But there are artists in this room that command 7 figures. I'm not one. And I think that the marketplace now has, it's capitalism. I can only answer this question in relationship to market, in relationship to capitalism, not in relationship to meaning. Meaning and value are completely different things. Meaning and quality, or you know, meaning and what the price of it, so for in substance. Thank you. So I've lost track. What was that again?
This idea whether this representation is just tokenism.
So no, I think also markets need to find new product. That's the whole thing. Markets keep moving. Capitalism will eat itself. The capitalist will sell the rope to hang himself with. That's true. So in finding new markets to exploit, it's going to be our turn. It's just going to be constant. And then again, you have a history of it's class. I mean, going back to the other question you asked us about post-black and the middle class, it's a whole class. It's a lot about class. Who was the opportunity to get to college? Who is given a certain kind of tools and negotiable skills to navigate a social landscape that is in the middle class. To understand and see the signs and gestures and be able to read it correctly and navigate that space. I mean, it's really difficult when you are not fluent and you cannot read those signs because you're only hearing loud noises and pushing and grating and so forth. I hope I'm not being too abstract. But when one is grown in an environment where the nuances and subtleties are not emphasized, it's just, get that, there's harshness, there's a certain coarseness. And so that is how you communicate, because that's how you've been communicated to, and that's been the only way you've been able to get something is through this coarseness. But that doesn't fly in the middle class. You have to know that coarseness has to be polished over, sandpapered over, and so on and so on. And it's more nuanced. So if that is the case with, so if that is the case, we can't disengage class with this idea of post-black or with this idea of art. And really, when you get to high art and art that comes into art history, that's a game that only the 1% can really play. Because the commands, I mean, you got to have a lot of capital to buy that 7-figure piece of art. And so we're making art that reflects our time and that has meaning, but ultimately in the marketplace, it maintains this very exclusive market, this very exclusive economy that's right at the top. So that question is really problematic, but it comes back to market, and it comes back to this capitalist, system that we're involved in. So that kind of sheds light on it.
But you have all navigated the boundaries of the marketplace, and to some extent, you have made your mark, and your presence felt. I mean, your aesthetic presence is very much evident in the marketplace. So you challenged, and I'm very fascinated by your statement for this exhibition, this constant challenge to structures of authority and power, to systems, and certainly the gallery, the marketplace, the academia, as you suggest, are systems within which interactions operate according to dynamics of class or race.
If I can keep going, when you asked, if we go back to Romeo Bearden, when he died, I was in the graduate program at Cal Arts, and here is the most significant black artist of the 20th century. He passes not a word, and I go to our dean, or the head of our department. I said, Bearden died. I mean, there's no students said anything, no faculty said anything. And if we have the most significant black artists of the 20th century pass away, and there's not a peep, what does that say for I'm not even going to compare myself to that. I mean, he's a giant, and I make no illusions that I have that level of skill or quality or talent. And so what that did to me, it gave me a very strong, I'm going to redouble my effort, because now I see the road ahead is going to be very bumpy. So I really got to get my grit. I've really got to be prepared for it. So now that we have several people who, there are many artists now who have the recognition, the quality. This room is just, I got to applaud. I'm so proud to be in this room. I'm so proud to be in this college, because I really identify with women's struggle and the history that goes along with that, because I think a lot of that has been my history. So for you to put this show on, I think there's a lot of parallels. you know, here in this space. So I think the context, as you were saying, of this show with the title, knowing the title of the show when you come in, that already sets up a certain kind of dialogue and conversation. I hope I'm not digressing too much. So maybe I am because I've lost my train. I'm explaining it, and I should give the chance to my other colleagues to go. So,
You're a success.
I think one thing I was gonna say in regards to that is, so like currently there's a Jacob Lawrence show, or it might just be coming down, that's at the Museum of Modern Art. And what really fascinates me is that thinking how a show like that, it happened at the Phillips Collection. I think they brought all of the migration series together. And this is the first time that they've been together since then, and I don't even know how long ago that was. But thinking about like an institution like the Museum of Modern Art that is kind of like the palace of modern art in the world, is putting on a show like that shows that there is a shift in, you know, they're playing catch up. You know, there's all these artists who are making, you know, David Hammond was making, making brilliant work for a really long time that hasn't been in these collections, hasn't had like a major retrospective. This guy wins a MacArthur Genius Award and still, you know, like where's the retrospective?
MacArthur Genius Award.
Yeah. And so I think now there's being a young artist working within this construct that there is a lot of catch up going on. Like to be a young black artist now is very hot because they're trying to catch up. Institutions have missed their mark. And I think that maybe there's overcompensation in some areas, maybe there isn't, but I think that a lot of it is really like a frenzy, it feels like. And that's really difficult to navigate because you don't want to be caught up or associated with that kind of frenzy. But I think that that's the landscape that we're in. And in part, you know, it's again, when I was at Yale, I was the only black student in my department. And I actually, one of the fellow classmates had told me that there was another artist from Detroit that had also gotten an interview. And I was the one that got in, and he didn't. He was a white guy. And so I'm sitting here thinking, so am I the voice for blackness in this institution now, for this department? Do I have to speak up on issues that I see? Am I the token in that way? And whether it came from that sort of intention or not, I think that it's something that you have to face, you have to deal with. And I think that maybe that reflects itself in the market too, that there's, if you're a part of a gallery that you're the only black artist on the gallery roster, then it makes you think, okay, well then, am I here to fill a void, or am I here to usher in other artists, or is that what generations are? Is there a shift? Is there a transition? Because people recognize it. I mean, it is hot. I mean, you look at someone like Kevin Wiley, who right out of graduate school just blew up.
Yeah.
Bringing some haterade over.
May I enlarge the conversation because, of course, we have had these conversations for the last couple of days, and there are endless possibilities to the way we can probe your visionary imagination, but I would very much like to engage the audience.
I keep thinking about the comment that Mark Bradford made to you about being unable to escape the gaze. And I think that was an American comment. It was a comment about American experience. And so I'll ask all three of you, but I'm thinking particularly of Toyin. How does regularly being in Africa or being from Africa in any way adjust the gaze?
It intensifies it. And within a minority group, it intensifies it. I was very much aware I was a foreigner the moment I landed here, being even in Berkeley, you know, with a group of other foreigners. But it wasn't until we moved to Alabama that I was like, oh, I'm African. I'm not just black, I'm African. Because other black kids would be like, girl, Africa. And it was that thing, you know, that joke, you know.
We're so sorry.
It was like, ooh, girls. It's a rough road ahead. You know, this idea of the gaze, I feel like, for me, it's a really interesting question. I find the gaze my ticket. You know, there's one thing, I guess, maybe living in New York for so long, I hate people staring at me. It's like a big thing. It's like, what, which one, you got a problem, you know? And so, to use that as a tool, you know, is, because you get it so often, it is triggering, you know, anyone who just stares at you like this for like 5 minutes, I'm just gonna look at you. Your hair is really nice. It's freaky, but that's what your life is as a minority. That's your life, just being stared at. That's what it feels like. And how do you bottle it up and push it out again, you know? And there's so many ways to do it conceptually, and, you know, with representational work or with sculpture, there's so many ways to engage with that. But oftentimes I find that people really don't get the feeling of that, you know, to live in that spotlight, in a weird spotlight, because it's, I don't know.
The gaze, I think of like Michel Foucault's idea and theory of the panopticon. The panopticon is what prisons are, the design pattern. You create this geometric space in the middle, then you put all the cells around it, and therefore the prisoners think that they're being watched all the time. So you can only have one guard in there, in the middle, yet everyone's responding as if they're being observed, and that's the gaze of the panopticon, okay? So that way we police ourselves, we police our conscience. And I used to police myself. I mean, when I'd go into a department store, I'd be extra, I wouldn't get too close to stuff because I wouldn't want them to think I'm trying to steal something and so forth, and I would impose all of these restrictions on my movement in public space because I did not want to be identified as a criminal or even subject to say, hey sir, please come over here. You know, oh no, everything's okay, you know. So, and that is, I think that is part of the gaze, too. So, as I've aged, I've pretty much made it a process of releasing that panopticon, releasing the self-policing, and just letting my body move through space. And by going to Africa, where it's a majority culture, that gaze does not exist. There's another one.
There is another gaze.
There's another one in its place, but that one's gone. And the one that is replaced is, I am called Obruni in Ghana. And Obruni is translated to white man. And sometimes they just call me, hey, white man. Because I'm from the West, I'm privileged, I may as well be a millionaire. You know, in certain places. Of course, not so much in the capital city, but when I get out of the capital city, in the less cosmopolitan environment, because we must say, you know, there is cosmopolitan, very urbane Africans and centers, but once you're out of there, it's quite different. But I'm there as a majority culture, and I've never experienced being part of a majority, but I'm not majority culture. In my head, I'm majority culture. But they can start off and go, you're not African. You know, it's very clear. However, I never had that experience of even thinking I'm part of majority culture, so something that majority culture doesn't even consider, right? So it was really, and so hence coming back, I've relinquished that gaze, I've relinquished that being, I mean, not clear that I'm other, but it's not in front of me totally. And so that's why I'm trying to deal with ideas that are global, a dark body in a global context, not in just an American context.
Landscape has come up several times, and you mentioned drawings of yourself as a landscape, as a space in which you inhabit. And Todd, you just mentioned that your whole identity changed when you were in a different place. And so where are you most at home? Where are you most yourself? Or does that actually really not matter? And Kevin, what's it like coming back to Lynchburg? And does that, you know, I don't know, unsettle you in some way, or is it comforting you in some way?
Tell the truth now.
Great, I think. I mean, again, I think for me it's that context. Like, I think that's essentially what could make an object, an artwork, is its context. That's the sort of defining factor. And so in some way, I feel like, yeah, like coming here and thinking about my artwork existing here in this way after all of these experiences, it's something that I actually feel like I need to even dig deeper into and really consider that even more. Yeah, I don't know.
Landscape, wait, what was the question? Like landscapes and...
And how it relates to yourself and your identity.
Oh wait, where am I most comfortable? Right. This is great segue into what we were discussing. I had a moment recently, which is, you know, I'm a crazy person, so I have many moments, but there was this moment where I realized, why am I afraid of being other? Like, what is the problem with it? The capital letter O, other. Like, what does that mean for me? And, you know, there's this Western education I have of it, you know, and the connotations of that. But other's freeing. It's a freeing space, you know? I told Evie in a very long-winded email, caffeine-filled, that when I think about power, when I think about minority relations or what have you, it's like an amphitheater. And the center stage is white, straight men. Pretty much, that's it. Usually young. I don't know what China and its population in a few years, but let's just say that's what it is now. And then the first couple seats where the lights bouncing off on the stage are like straight white women, probably white gay men, you know. And then as you go further up, the amphitheater gets darker and darker and darker. And it varies in degree, but we're all focusing on the center stage. We're all looking at the stage and saying, I want some of that light, I want that. And that's why otherness is uncomfortable. I don't care about the stage anymore. Plus the show's been going on for centuries, and quite frankly, it's a boring show. I'm interested in people in the back, or people alongside me. You know, what's going on here? Well, the light's not here. We have the freedom to make up our own show, and no one will even know about it in the front because they're so concerned about that thing. But here we are in this darkness, and we can make our own little thing. And that's fun to me. And that's a kind of a scary thing to come to realize. Like, there is options, you know. And that, to me, I feel free when I consider that mentally. Like, there are options.
I just completed an artwork. It was a year-long action. It started May 20th, 2014, and ended May 20th, 2015. What I did was I wore the clothes of the deceased musician named Ray Manzarek, who was the keyboardist for The Doors. I collaborated with Ray Manzarek several times. I was the webmaster for The Doors website. I had worked with him, and when he passed, I went to his wife. I traveled to San Francisco, went to his wife, and I said, you know, I would like to do a piece in memory of him, because his spirit was incredible. And The Doors, when I was growing up, I listened to Break On Through to the Other Side, When the Music's Over, every night when I was 14 before I went. That radicalized my thinking, you know. And plus, Jimi Hendrix of 6 was 9. So, those were my 3. So he really influenced, not he and Jim Morrison and Robbie Krieger and John Dinsmore really influenced my way of thought. So here I am for 1 year wearing Issei Miyake, Yoji Yamamoto, Comme des Garçons, all of this fabulous, because he loved clothes. He didn't even wear one pair of jeans. So she sent me actually the Doors archive, sent me his whole wardrobe, and there was not one pair of jeans. I said, oh my God, now class signifiers. I don't dress with these class signifiers, you know, Uber Barneys, everything from Barneys, Uber class signifiers. So that was, and every day I have to wear this, and then I'm conscious of this man that's passed. Little does anyone know, I'm wearing rock and roll history. This group that played, but basically Morrison said, all we do is play the blues, but we speed it up. He says the Doors are a blues band, you know. So I just want to answer like that. It's gotten to this point where I am free enough to wear these clothes of a white Polish musician who's really influenced a lot of American pop culture, and not think of nothing of it, you know. But I love the fluxus nature of it. You know, that I'm talking to you, but this is an artwork that you're not aware of. And now a museum has asked, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles has asked me to wear clothes from this date to this date because they want me to reenact this performance, and everybody's going to send out a press release so that this artwork in the Hammer is floating around the city.
Please stay and have more casual conversations with the artists and with Evie, and thank you so much for coming. Enjoy our reception in the other gallery, and thanks again.